Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Foundation. David Thornfield had built his life on three pillars: precision, loyalty, and consequences. At 38, he owned a successful private security firm that specialized in corporate espionage and personal protection. His clients ranged from Fortune 500 CEOs to politicians who needed problems solved quietly. David himself was a former Marine reconnaissance specialist who had learned early that mercy was a luxury he couldn't afford. He met Jennifer Holloway during a protection detail for her father, a federal judge who had received death threats. Jennifer was 25 then, fresh out of law school, with auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to see through people. She was working as a prosecutor, passionate about justice, or so David thought. Their courtship was intense but brief. Within 8 months, they were married in a ceremony that made the society pages. Their daughter Emma was born 2 years later, a perfect blend of David's steel-gray eyes and Jennifer's delicate features. For 6 years, David believed he had everything a man could want: a beautiful wife, an adorable daughter, and a business that provided the kind of wealth that bought freedom. Jennifer had always been close to her father, Judge Ronald Holloway, a stern man who had never quite approved of David despite his success. The judge's estate sat on 40 acres outside the city, complete with a main house, guest cottage, and extensive grounds. Emma loved visiting her grandfather, who spoiled her with horseback riding lessons and elaborate tea parties. What David didn't know was that his wife had been living a double life for over a year. Dr. Trevor Mansfield, a surgeon at the city's premier hospital, had been more than just the family physician. He was Jennifer's lover, her escape from what she had grown to see as the suffocating intensity of her marriage to a man who measured everything in terms of loyalty and betrayal. Trevor was everything David wasn't: smooth where David was rough, charming where David was direct, sympathetic where David was pragmatic. He was also married to Patricia Mansfield, a socialite who spent her time organizing charity galas and had no idea her husband was planning to leave her for Jennifer. The affair had started innocently enough during Emma's routine checkup. Jennifer had complained about feeling overwhelmed, and Trevor had suggested private sessions to discuss her stress. Those sessions moved from his office to hotel rooms, from professional sympathy to passionate embraces. For Jennifer, it felt like awakening from a long sleep. David's business had taught him to read people, to spot deception and track behavioral patterns. But love, he discovered, was the perfect blind spot. The woman who shared his bed, who kissed him goodbye each morning, who attended his business dinners with perfect poise, had become a stranger wearing his wife's face. The plan Jennifer and Trevor had hatched was elegant in its simplicity. Jennifer would file for divorce, claiming irreconcilable differences. With her father's connections and Trevor's substantial income, she would seek primary custody of Emma. They would start fresh, perhaps in another state where Trevor could establish a new practice. Neither of them understood that David Thornfield wasn't the type of man who simply accepted loss. In his world, betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a declaration of war. Chapter 2, The Discovery. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while David was reviewing security protocols for a new client. Jennifer's voice was strained, almost panicked. "David, you need to come to the hospital. It's Emma." The drive to St. Catherine's Hospital took 12 minutes, though David's mind processed a dozen scenarios in that time. He found Jennifer in the pediatric ward's waiting room, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a coffee cup. "What happened?" David's voice carried the controlled calm he used in crisis situations. "She fell down the stairs at Dad's house. The bruises on her back, they look worse than they are, but I wanted to make sure she didn't have internal injuries." David studied his wife's face, noting the way her eyes didn't quite meet his, the slight tension in her shoulders. Something felt off, but his concern for Emma overrode his suspicions. Dr. Trevor Mansfield appeared in the doorway, his expression professionally concerned. "Mr. and Mrs. Thornfield? I'm Dr. Mansfield. I've been examining Emma." David shook the man's hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. He seemed competent, trustworthy. How is she? She's going to be fine. No broken bones, no internal bleeding. The bruising is consistent with a fall downstairs, though quite extensive. Children are remarkably resilient. As they spoke, David caught something in the way Trevor's eyes lingered on Jennifer, the barely perceptible softening of his expression when he addressed her. It was subtle, the kind of detail most people would miss, but David had spent years learning to read micro-expressions and body language. "Can we see her?" Jennifer asked. "Of course. She's been asking for both of you." Emma was sitting up in the hospital bed, looking small against the white sheets. Her back was covered with dark bruises that made David's chest tighten with protective fury. "Daddy," she reached for him, and he gathered her carefully in his arms. "Hey, princess, how are you feeling?" "It hurts, but the doctor said I'm brave." She looked proudly at Trevor, who smiled warmly. "That's right. You're one of the bravest patients I've ever had." David spent the next hour with his daughter, listening to her recount the fall, watching her interact with the medical staff. Something nagged at him about the whole situation, but he couldn't pinpoint what. It was when they were preparing to leave that Dr. Mansfield pulled him aside privately. "Mr. Thornfield, I need to speak with you about something sensitive." Trevor's voice dropped to a whisper. "The bruising pattern on Emma's back. While it could be from a fall, there are some aspects that concern me." David's blood chilled. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that as a mandatory reporter, I have obligations. But I also understand that sometimes children get hurt in ways that appear suspicious, but are actually innocent. I wanted to discuss this with you first, as her father." The implications hit David like a physical blow. "You think someone hurt her deliberately?" "I think we need to be very careful about who has access to her until we understand exactly what happened." David looked across the room at Jennifer, who was helping Emma put on her shoes. His wife caught his gaze and smiled, the same loving smile she'd given him thousands of times. But now, with Trevor's words echoing in his mind, David began to see cracks in the facade. "What are you recommending?" "I'd like to have another doctor examine her, get a second opinion on the injury pattern. And perhaps Emma should stay with you for a while, until we have more clarity." David nodded slowly. "I appreciate your concern, doctor. We'll take every precaution." As they left the hospital, Emma, between them holding both their hands, David's mind was already working. The protective father in him wanted to believe this was just a tragic accident. But the professional investigator in him recognized the setup, saw the threads of a larger pattern beginning to emerge. That night, after Emma was safely asleep in her own bed, David sat in his study and made his first real decision about the path ahead. He opened his laptop and began accessing resources that most people didn't know existed, databases and surveillance tools that his security firm used for client investigations. If someone was playing games with his family, David Thornfield was going to learn the rules, and then he was going to rewrite them entirely. Chapter 3: The Web Unravels. David's investigation began with what he knew best: digital surveillance. His company maintained contracts with several telecommunications firms, which gave him access to metadata that revealed calling patterns and location data. Within 48 hours, he had a clear picture of Jennifer's movements over the past 6 months. The pattern was damning. Regular visits to the downtown Marriott, always on afternoons when Emma was at school. Phone calls to a number registered to Dr. Trevor Mansfield, sometimes lasting over an hour. GPS data showing her car at the hospital on days when no appointments were scheduled. But David needed more than circumstantial evidence. He needed the complete picture. Using skills learned from years of corporate espionage, David installed monitoring software on Jennifer's laptop and phone. The process took less than 5 minutes while she showered, and within hours, he was reading text messages that felt like daggers to his chest. "I can't wait to start our life together. Emma will love the house in Colorado." David suspects nothing. "Once the divorce is final, we can be open about everything. I've been thinking about Dad's estate. If something happened to him, the inheritance would make everything easier." That last message stopped David cold. Judge Holloway was 73 and in good health, but he was also worth nearly $20 million. More importantly, He was the only person who might have exposed Jennifer's affair if he had discovered it. David cross-referenced the timeline of messages with Emma's accident. The pieces began fitting together in a way that made his blood run cold. Jennifer had taken Emma to her father's house not for a visit, but as part of a larger plan. The accident was meant to create a medical record that would support claims of negligence or abuse against David. Dr. Trevor Mansfield wasn't just Jennifer's lover. He was her co-conspirator. His concern about the injury pattern was designed to plant seeds of suspicion against David in official records. If Child Protective Services became involved, Jennifer would have documented evidence of her concerns about her daughter's safety with her father. The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. Create evidence of David's unfitness as a father, file for divorce with adultery claims to put him on the defensive, and walk away with custody, alimony, and eventually a share of Judge Holloway's estate, when Trevor's medical expertise proved useful in hastening the old man's demise. David had seen corporate espionage and political dirty tricks, but this felt personal in a way that ignited something primal in his character. They weren't just stealing money or information. They were trying to steal his daughter and frame him as an abuser. That evening, David maintained perfect normalcy. He helped Emma with her homework, listened to Jennifer talk about her day at the prosecutor's office, where she was probably planning to quit once the divorce proceedings began, and made love to his wife with the same passion he always had. Jennifer noticed nothing different. She fell asleep in his arms, probably dreaming of her new life with Trevor while David stared at the ceiling, planning her destruction. The next morning, David made a series of phone calls. His security firm had contacts in law enforcement, private investigation, and what some might call the gray areas between legal and illegal problem solving. By noon, he had a team assembled. Marcus Kane was a former DEA agent who specialized in long-term surveillance. Patricia Wolf was a forensic accountant who could trace financial irregularities through the most complex corporate structures. And Samuel Rodriguez was what polite society called a security consultant, a man who solved problems that couldn't be addressed through official channels. I need complete profiles on Dr. Trevor Mansfield and his financial situation, David told them during their meeting at his office. I need to know every detail of his marriage, his practice, his habits, and his vulnerabilities. What's the timeline? Marcus asked. I want everything within a week. And I want it so thoroughly documented that when I move, there won't be any possibility of recovery. Patricia pulled up Mansfield's initial financial records on her laptop. He's leveraged heavily. The medical practice, his house, even his cars are financed. His wife Patricia has family money, but it's all in trust funds he can't access directly. So he needs Jennifer's divorce settlement and her father's inheritance to maintain his lifestyle, David mused. Looks that way. And if he's planning to relocate his practice to Colorado like the messages suggest, he'll need significant capital. David stood and walked to the window overlooking the city. Somewhere out there, his wife and her lover thought they were playing chess with a man who didn't even know the game had started. They were about to learn that David Thornfield didn't just play chess. He rewrote the rules until winning was the only possible outcome. Gentlemen, lady, he said, turning back to his team. Let's begin. Chapter 4. The Hunter Becomes the Hunted. David's plan required patience, precision, and the kind of orchestrated manipulation that he had perfected in the corporate world. But this time, the stakes were personal, and failure wasn't an option. The first phase involved establishing Trevor Mansfield's true character. David knew that men who would use a child as a pawn in their schemes usually had other moral compromises in their past. Marcus Kane's surveillance revealed that Trevor had a pattern: expensive tastes, gambling debts carefully hidden from his wife Patricia, and a history of manipulating wealthy female patients into personal relationships. He's done this before, Marcus reported during their second meeting. 3 times in the past decade. Always married women, always wealthy, always ended when he extracted maximum financial benefit. Patricia Wolf had been equally thorough. His medical practice is drowning in debt. He's borrowed against equipment, delayed payments to staff, and his malpractice insurance is 6 months behind. If Patricia's family money wasn't covering his house payments, he'd be bankrupt. But the most interesting discovery came from Samuel Rodriguez, whose methods David preferred not to examine too closely. Mansfield has been prescribing unnecessary medications to elderly patients and selling the excess on the black market. Small amounts, nothing that would trigger official scrutiny, but enough to generate significant cash. David absorbed this information with the cold satisfaction of a predator circling wounded prey. Trevor Mansfield wasn't just an adulterer. He was a criminal who had been using his medical practice to fund his lifestyle while planning to destroy David's family. What about his relationship with my wife? They meet twice a week at the downtown Marriott, room 1247. They've been planning the divorce timeline for months. According to their conversations, Jennifer is supposed to file papers next week, immediately after they create another incident involving Emma. The blood drained from David's face. Another incident? They're planning to claim you've been violent with both Jennifer and Emma. Mansfield has been coaching her on how to create believable injuries that would support her claims. David's hands clenched into fists. The idea of anyone using his daughter as a prop in their scheme triggered a rage that he struggled to contain. But rage was a tool, and David had learned long ago how to channel his emotions into effective action. I need you to document everything. Every meeting, every conversation, every plan they make. I want evidence that will not only destroy them legally, but make them understand the consequences of threatening my family. The second phase of David's plan required him to become an actor in his own home. He continued his normal routine, maintained his loving relationship with Emma, and showed no signs of suspicion toward Jennifer. But now every conversation was calculated, every gesture designed to gather more information about their timeline. Emma's teacher wants to schedule a parent conference next week. Jennifer mentioned over dinner. Maybe you can handle it? I've been so busy with the Morrison case. David recognized the lie immediately. The Morrison case had been closed 2 weeks ago, and Jennifer's distraction had nothing to do with work. She was probably planning to be with Trevor during the scheduled conference. Of course. Which day works best? Thursday afternoon would be perfect. Thursday afternoon was when their incident was supposed to occur, according to Marcus's surveillance. David smiled warmly at his wife, the same loving expression he'd worn throughout their marriage. I'll make sure my schedule is clear. That night, David lay awake listening to Jennifer breathe beside him, planning her destruction with the same methodical precision he brought to corporate takeovers. She had made one crucial error in her planning. She had underestimated the man she was betraying. David Thornfield wasn't just successful because he was smart or ruthless. He was successful because he understood that in any conflict, the person who controls the information controls the outcome. And Jennifer had just handed him complete control over the battlefield. The next morning, David made another series of calls. This time, he reached out to contacts in family court, child protective services, and the state medical board. Not to file complaints, but to understand exactly how their systems worked and how they could be manipulated. By the end of the week, David had a complete picture of his opponent's plan and a counter-strategy that would not only defeat them, but ensure they faced consequences that would last the rest of their lives. Jennifer thought she was married to a successful businessman who trusted her completely. She was about to discover that she had been living with a man who could orchestrate the systematic destruction of anyone who threatened his family. The war was about to begin, and David intended to win it so decisively that no one would ever dare threaten what he valued again. Chapter 5. The Trap is Set. Thursday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of autumn, and David woke with the focused energy of a man about to execute a plan months in the making. Every detail had been orchestrated, every contingency planned, every escape route closed. Jennifer kissed him goodbye with the same affection she'd shown throughout their marriage, never suspecting that her husband knew exactly where she was going and what she intended to do. I'll probably be late tonight, she said, adjusting her prosecutor's badge on her jacket lapel. The Morrison appeal is more complex than we anticipated. David smiled and pulled her close, inhaling the scent of the perfume Trevor had given her for her birthday. Take your time. Emma and I will have a father-daughter evening. As soon as Jennifer's car disappeared down the driveway, David activated the final phase of his plan. Marcus Kane was already positioned outside the Marriott Hotel with long-range recording equipment. Patricia Wolf had been working with contacts in the state medical board to prepare fraud charges against Trevor. And Samuel Rodriguez was handling the aspects of David's revenge that required a more direct approach. The first call David made was to Emma's school, confirming that she would be staying late for after-school care. His daughter would be completely safe and accounted for during everything that followed. The second call was to his attorney, Richard Blackwell, a man who specialized in high-stakes divorce cases and had a reputation for protecting his client's interests by any means necessary. "Richard, it's time. I need you to file the papers we discussed. Are you certain about the timing, David? Once we move, there's no going back." "I'm certain. They think they're setting me up. Instead, they're walking into a trap that will destroy them both." The third call was to Judge Patricia Hendricks, a family court judge who owed David a favor from a previous security consultation. "Patricia, I need to schedule an emergency hearing regarding my daughter's safety. I have evidence of planned abuse and manipulation that requires immediate intervention." By noon, David had set in motion a series of events that would unfold with mechanical precision. Jennifer and Trevor thought they were the hunters, but they were about to become prey in a game where David controlled every move. At 2:30 p.m., Jennifer arrived at the Marriott Hotel, unaware that every step was being recorded. Trevor was waiting in room 1247, equally oblivious to the surveillance equipment that Marcus had installed during the hotel's staff shift change. Their conversation, captured in high-definition audio and video, was exactly what David had expected. "Are you ready for this?" Trevor asked, his hands gently touching the fake bruises that makeup had created on Jennifer's arms. "I'm scared," Jennifer admitted. "What if David fights the custody claim? He won't have a choice. Once we document his pattern of abuse, the court will have to protect Emma. And with your father's influence, we'll have support throughout the legal system." "What about the money?" "David's business accounts are protected by corporate structures." Trevor smiled confidently. "That's why we need the life insurance. Once the divorce creates financial pressure and he becomes desperate, accidents happen, especially to men who take risks in their line of work." David watched the live stream on his phone, his expression never changing even as his wife discussed his murder with clinical detachment. He had known Jennifer was capable of betrayal, but the casual way she planned his death revealed a level of evil that surprised even him. At 3:15 p.m., David called 911 to report a domestic violence incident at his home address. When police arrived, they found Jennifer's car in the driveway. David had driven it back from the hotel parking lot, and signs of struggle in the living room that David had carefully staged. "My wife called me at work, screaming that someone had broken in," David told the responding officers. "When I got here, she was gone. Her car is here, but she's not answering her phone." The officers took the report seriously, especially when David mentioned that his 6-year-old daughter had recently been injured in a suspicious accident at her grandfather's house. At 4 p.m., while police were processing the fake crime scene, Jennifer and Trevor were arrested at the hotel by federal agents on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence was overwhelming. Months of surveillance footage, recorded conversations, financial records showing Trevor's debts and fraudulent prescriptions, and Jennifer's own messages detailing their plan to kill David and frame him for child abuse. But David's revenge was just beginning. The arrests were timed to coincide with the afternoon shift change at Patricia Mansfield's charity office. She received the news of her husband's arrest while surrounded by the social circle that defined her identity. The humiliation was public and complete. Judge Ronald Holloway learned of his daughter's crimes during a dinner party with fellow judges and politicians. The scandal would end his career and destroy his reputation in the legal community he had served for 40 years. By 6 p.m., every news outlet in the city was covering the story of the prosecutor and doctor who had planned to murder the prosecutor's husband and frame him for child abuse. David's security firm was mentioned only briefly as the successful businessman who had been targeted by the conspiracy. David picked up Emma from school as planned, acting the role of the shocked and grieved husband who had just learned of his wife's betrayal. "Where's Mommy?" Emma asked as they drove home. Mommy made some very bad choices, princess. But you and I are going to be fine. Better than fine. That evening, as David helped Emma with her homework and made her favorite dinner, he felt the satisfaction of a man who had not just won a war, but had redefined the terms of victory. Jennifer and Trevor thought they could use his daughter as a weapon against him. Instead, they had handed him the tools of their own destruction. And tomorrow, the real punishment would begin. Chapter 6: The Reckoning Begins. The Federal Detention Center was a gray, concrete monument to broken dreams and shattered lives. Jennifer sat in her orange jumpsuit, staring at the metal table where her attorney had laid out the evidence against her. The recordings, the surveillance footage, the financial documents. It was a perfect prosecution case with no possible defense. "How did he know?" she whispered, her voice hollow with disbelief. Her attorney, a public defender named Sarah Chun, shook her head. "Your husband is a professional investigator, Jennifer. He has resources and connections that most people can't imagine. The question isn't how he found out. It's why you thought you could deceive someone who specializes in uncovering deception." In a separate conference room, Trevor Mansfield was having his own reckoning. His attorney was explaining that the federal charges carried minimum sentences of 25 years, and that the evidence included recorded conversations where Trevor discussed murdering David Thornfield. "There has to be a way out of this," Trevor insisted. "David set us up. He manipulated us into those conversations." "Dr. Mansfield, your own words are on tape discussing insurance fraud, prescription drug sales, and murder conspiracy. David Thornfield didn't force you to say those things. He simply recorded you saying them." Meanwhile, David was at home with Emma, maintaining the routine that kept his daughter's world stable while her mother's world collapsed. He read her bedtime stories, helped her brush her teeth, and tucked her in with the same loving care he had always shown. "Daddy, will Mommy come home soon?" Emma asked as he turned off her light. "I don't know, princess, but I promise you, no matter what happens, you'll always be safe with me." After Emma fell asleep, David sat in his study reviewing the financial documents that Patricia Wolf had prepared. Trevor's medical practice was being investigated by the state medical board. His prescription fraud had triggered a DEA investigation, and his malpractice insurance had been canceled due to non-payment. Patricia Mansfield had filed for divorce within hours of her husband's arrest, claiming alienation of affection and seeking damages from Jennifer personally. Her family's attorneys were some of the most expensive in the state, and they had already frozen all of Trevor's assets. Judge Ronald Holloway had submitted his resignation from the bench rather than face an ethics investigation. His political allies had abandoned him overnight, and his 40-year career in public service was ending in disgrace. But David's revenge was far more comprehensive than simple legal consequences. Using his connections in the private security industry, David had ensured that Trevor's name appeared on every medical malpractice database in the country. Even if he eventually served his sentence and was released from prison, he would never practice medicine again. Jennifer's legal career was similarly destroyed. Her law license was suspended pending the outcome of her criminal trial, and every case she had prosecuted was being reviewed for potential misconduct. Defendants she had convicted were filing appeals, claiming that a prosecutor who planned murder and child abuse couldn't be trusted to seek justice fairly. David had also used his corporate intelligence network to ensure that their story reached professional circles across the country. Trevor's name was circulated among medical associations as a cautionary tale about ethics violations. Jennifer's case was discussed in law schools as an example of how personal corruption could destroy an entire career. The financial destruction was equally complete. Jennifer's assets were frozen pending restitution claims from David for emotional distress and threats against Emma. Trevor's medical practice was being liquidated to pay creditors, and his personal assets were being seized by federal authorities. Within a week, both Jennifer and Trevor had lost everything they had ever worked for. Their reputations, their careers, their financial security, and their freedom were all gone. But David's most brutal stroke was the social isolation he had orchestrated. Jennifer's father refused to take her calls from prison. Her former colleagues in the prosecutor's office avoided any association with her name. Her friends from law school and social circles gradually stopped responding to her letters. Trevor faced similar exile. Patricia had made it clear that any friend or colleague who maintained contact with her ex-husband would be cut off from her family's considerable social and financial influence. David had weaponized their own ambition against them. The same social and professional networks they had hoped to exploit for their scheme now rejected them completely. 3 weeks after their arrest, Jennifer received a letter from David's attorney. It was noticed that David was filing for divorce on grounds of adultery and conspiracy, seeking full custody of Emma with no visitation rights for Jennifer. The letter also informed her that David was suing her personally for damages related to the conspiracy against him and the emotional trauma caused to their daughter. The amount of the civil suit was carefully calculated, exactly enough to ensure that even if Jennifer served her minimum sentence and was eventually released, she would spend the rest of her life working to pay off the debt to the man she had tried to destroy. That night, David sat in his study with a glass of whiskey, reviewing the complete file of his revenge. Every detail had been executed perfectly. Every loose end was tied off. Every consequence was designed to last for the rest of his enemies' lives. Tomorrow, he would begin the final phase of his plan, the part that would ensure Emma grew up understanding that actions have consequences and that loyalty was the most important value in the Thornfield family. Chapter 7. The Final Moves. 6 months after Jennifer and Trevor's arrest, their federal trial began with the kind of media attention that David had carefully orchestrated. Every detail of their conspiracy was laid bare in open court, from the fake bruises on Emma to the recorded conversations about murdering David for insurance money. David attended every day of the trial, sitting in the gallery with Emma beside him. His daughter, now 7, was old enough to understand that her mother had made terrible choices, though David shielded her from the most disturbing details. "Why did Mommy want to hurt you, Daddy?" Emma asked one evening after a particularly difficult day of testimony. David chose his words carefully. "Sometimes people get lost, Princess. They want things so badly that they forget what's truly important. Your mother forgot that family means protecting each other, not hurting each other." The trial lasted 3 weeks. Jennifer and Trevor were convicted on all counts, receiving sentences of 30 years each. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, noted the particularly heinous nature of using a child as a weapon in their conspiracy. The defendants didn't just plan to commit murder, Judge Harrison stated. They planned to destroy an innocent child's relationship with her father and traumatize her with false accusations of abuse. This level of calculation and cruelty toward a child demands the maximum sentence allowed by law. As the verdicts were read, David watched Jennifer's face crumble with the realization that her life was effectively over. She would be 68 years old when she was eligible for parole, assuming she lived that long in federal prison. Trevor's reaction was different, a kind of hollow shock that suggested he still couldn't believe his plan had failed so completely. The charming doctor who had manipulated wealthy women for decades was now just another convicted felon facing the rest of his life behind bars. But the trial was only the legal conclusion of David's revenge. The social and financial consequences continued to ripple outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Patricia Mansfield's divorce had been finalized within weeks of Trevor's conviction, with a settlement that gave her everything while leaving Trevor with nothing but his legal debts. She had also filed a civil suit against Jennifer for alienation of affection, seeking damages for the destruction of her marriage. Judge Holloway's resignation had been followed by a cascade of consequences. His pension was reduced due to the ethics violations associated with his daughter's crimes. His country club membership was revoked. The law firm where he had planned to work as a consultant withdrew their offer. The old man, who had once commanded respect throughout the legal community, now lived alone in a small apartment, his reputation destroyed by his daughter's choices. David had also ensured that the extended consequences reached everyone who had enabled or supported the conspiracy. Hotel employees who had looked the other way during Jennifer and Trevor's meetings found themselves facing employment difficulties. The prosecutor's office conducted a complete review of Jennifer's cases, leading to embarrassing reversals and professional consequences for her supervisors. Even Trevor's medical practice partners faced scrutiny. The DEA investigation into his prescription fraud had expanded to examine the entire practice, resulting in license suspensions and financial audits that destroyed the careers of doctors who had trusted him. David's revenge was comprehensive and permanent. But more importantly, it served as a lesson for Emma about the nature of consequences and loyalty. "Daddy," Emma said one evening as they worked on a puzzle together, "will I ever see Mommy again?" David considered his answer carefully. Emma was young, but she was intelligent enough to understand truth when it was presented appropriately. "Someday, when you're older, you might choose to visit her in prison if you want to. But she made choices that hurt our family, and actions have consequences. The most important thing for you to remember is that loyalty works both ways. People who are loyal to you deserve your loyalty in return, and people who betray you don't deserve forgiveness." Emma nodded solemnly, her young mind processing the lesson that would shape her understanding of relationships for the rest of her life. That night, David received a letter from Jennifer's attorney. She was requesting permission to write letters to Emma, claiming that maintaining some connection with her mother would be beneficial for the child's development. David read the request twice, then fed it into his office shredder. Jennifer had forfeited her right to influence Emma's development when she chose to use their daughter as a weapon. Emma would grow up knowing the truth about her mother's choices, but she would not be subjected to manipulation disguised as maternal love. The letter was Jennifer's last attempt to reach her daughter. David's legal team had ensured that all future communications would be blocked and that Emma's location and school information were protected by court order. As far as the law was concerned, Jennifer Thornfield no longer existed in her daughter's life. David poured himself a glass of whiskey and stood at his study window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere in a federal prison, his ex-wife was learning what it meant to cross a man who valued loyalty above all else. Somewhere else, Trevor Mansfield was discovering that manipulating the wrong person could cost everything. And in her bedroom upstairs, Emma Thornfield was sleeping peacefully, protected by a father who would never forgive anyone who threatened his family. The game was over. David had won so completely that his enemies would spend the rest of their lives paying for their mistakes. Chapter 8. Lessons in Loyalty. 2 years had passed since the trial, and Emma was thriving in ways that surprised even David. At 9 years old, she had developed the kind of emotional intelligence and moral clarity that most adults never achieved. The trauma of her mother's betrayal had been transformed into strength through David's careful guidance and unwavering protection. "Tell me again about the business trip to Chicago," Emma said as they sat at breakfast on a Saturday morning. David traveled frequently for his security firm, and Emma had learned to think of these trips as adventures they planned together. "Well, I'll be gone for 4 days, but Mrs. Rodriguez will stay with you, and we'll video call every evening at 8 o'clock. David had hired Maria Rodriguez, Samuel's sister, as Emma's nanny and companion. She was a former teacher with a warm personality and unshakable loyalty to David's family. "Will you bring me something from Chicago?" "Of course. What would you like?" Emma considered this seriously. "A book about strong women who protect their families." David smiled, recognizing his own values reflected in his daughter's request. Emma was learning that strength and loyalty were the most important qualities a person could possess. The Chicago trip was actually a business expansion that would serve a dual purpose. David was opening a branch office that specialized in protecting children from parental kidnapping and abuse. The irony wasn't lost on him. His own experience with Jennifer's attempted manipulation had given him unique insights into how to protect other families from similar threats. But Chicago also represented the final phase of David's long-term strategy. Trevor Mansfield's brother, Dr. Richard Mansfield, practiced medicine there and had been quietly trying to rehabilitate his family's reputation by claiming that Trevor had been manipulated by Jennifer. David had learned of this effort through his network of contacts and had decided that the Mansfield family needed a more complete understanding of consequences. Dr. Richard Mansfield ran a successful pediatric practice and had no criminal record, but he had also been providing financial support to Trevor's legal defense fund and had written letters to the parole board requesting early release consideration. David's approach to Richard was subtle but effective. Using his connections in the medical insurance industry, David arranged for Richard's practice to face a series of audits and reviews that would gradually make his business unsustainable. Nothing illegal, nothing that could be traced back to David directly. Just the kind of regulatory pressure and bureaucratic obstacles that could destroy a medical practice over time. Richard Mansfield would spend years fighting to save his career, never quite understanding why every aspect of his professional life had become so difficult. By the time he realized the connection to his brother's crimes, his practice would be bankrupt and his reputation would be destroyed. The message was clear. Loyalty to David's enemies would not be tolerated, even from family members who hadn't been directly involved in the original conspiracy. During his Chicago trip, David also met with federal prosecutors who were handling similar cases in other jurisdictions. His experience with Jennifer and Trevor had made him a valuable consultant for cases involving domestic conspiracy and child manipulation. Your case has become a model for how to investigate and prosecute these types of schemes, Assistant U.S. Attorney Linda Walsh told him over dinner. The evidence compilation and surveillance techniques your team used are being taught in law enforcement seminars across the country. David nodded, pleased that his revenge had served a larger purpose. I hope other families don't have to learn these lessons the hard way. Your approach saved a lot of time and resources in the prosecution. Most importantly, it ensured that the defendants couldn't claim they were victims of entrapment or manipulation. They convicted themselves with their own words and actions. When David returned to Chicago, Emma greeted him at the airport with the excitement of a child who had missed her father but had also grown more confident during his absence. Mrs. Rodriguez taught me how to cook pasta, and I finished 3 books while you were gone, Emma reported as they drove home. 3 books? That's impressive. What did you learn? I learned that the strongest people are the ones who protect others, not the ones who hurt others. And I learned that loyalty is like a promise you make with your actions, not just your words. David glanced at his daughter in the rearview mirror, seeing a maturity that was both remarkable and concerning. Emma was growing up with a very clear understanding of how the world worked, shaped by experiences that most children never faced. That's exactly right, princess. Loyalty is shown through actions, especially when it's difficult or dangerous to be loyal. That evening, as they worked on Emma's homework together, David reflected on how completely his life had changed. 2 years ago, he had been a successful businessman with a beautiful wife and daughter, believing he had everything a man could want. Now he was a single father who had systematically destroyed everyone who had threatened his family, teaching his daughter lessons about loyalty and consequences that would shape her character for life. Jennifer and Trevor were beginning their 3rd year in federal prison, with 27 years remaining on their sentences. Judge Holloway had died 6 months earlier from a heart attack, alone and disgraced. Richard Mansfield's medical practice was facing its 4th regulatory audit in 18 months. The ripple effects of David's revenge continued to spread, touching everyone who had been connected to the conspiracy or who had supported his enemies afterward. But more importantly, Emma was growing up strong, confident, and clear about the difference between right and wrong. She understood that actions had consequences, that loyalty was earned through behavior, and that people who threatened families deserved no mercy. David had built a legacy that would last far beyond the prison sentences of his enemies. He had raised a daughter who would never tolerate betrayal and would never underestimate the importance of protecting those she loved. The lesson was complete, and the future was secure. Chapter 9. The Unforgiving Legacy. 5 years had passed since the trial that had destroyed Jennifer and Trevor's lives, and Emma was now 12 years old, entering her teenage years with a strength and clarity that impressed everyone who met her. She had grown into a beautiful young woman with her father's steel-gray eyes and a moral compass that was absolutely uncompromising. David's security firm had expanded internationally, specializing in corporate espionage and family protection services. His reputation in the industry was legendary, not just for his technical skills, but for his absolute dedication to his client's security. The Jennifer case, as it was known in professional circles, had become a textbook example of how to handle domestic threats with precision and finality. "Dad, I've been thinking about something," Emma said one evening as they sat in David's study, her homework spread across the mahogany desk that had once belonged to Judge Holloway. David had bought the desk at the estate sale after the old man's death, a final reminder of how completely he had dismantled his enemies' lives. "What's on your mind, Princess?" "Mrs. Patterson at school says that forgiveness is important, that holding grudges hurts the person who holds them more than the person who did wrong. But that doesn't seem right to me." David set down the security report he was reviewing and gave Emma his complete attention. These conversations had become more frequent as she grew older, and they were among the most important moments in their relationship. "What do you think about forgiveness, Emma?" "I think it depends on what someone did and whether they would do it again if they had the chance. Some people make mistakes, but other people make choices. Mommy didn't make a mistake. She made a choice to hurt our family and use me as a weapon against you." The maturity of Emma's analysis never ceased to amaze David. At 12, she understood human nature better than most adults. "That's exactly right. Forgiveness is something that should be earned, not given freely to people who haven't changed their character or acknowledged the harm they've caused." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Have you ever heard from Mommy since she went to prison?" "She's written letters to both of us over the years. I've kept them in case you ever want to read them when you're older, but I've never responded to them." "Good. Actions have consequences, and her actions were unforgivable." David studied his daughter's face, seeing the woman she was becoming. Emma had inherited his intensity and his protective instincts, but she had also developed a compassion for innocent people that balanced her ruthlessness toward those who chose evil. At school, Emma was known for standing up to bullies and protecting younger students. She had once gotten detention for punching a boy who was picking on a girl with disabilities, and when the principal called David to discuss her violent behavior, David had simply asked if the boy had stopped bullying other children. "Yes, he seems to have learned his lesson," the principal admitted. Then Emma accomplished her objective. Sometimes people only understand consequences, not conversations. That evening, David received a call from his attorney with news he had been expecting for some time. "Jennifer's parole hearing is coming up next month," Richard Blackwell informed him. "She's served 7 years, and the parole board will consider early release for good behavior. What are the chances they'll approve it?" "Normally, I'd say minimal for someone convicted of conspiracy to commit murder. But she's been a model prisoner. She's earned her GED and a bachelor's degree through prison programs, and she's expressed remorse for her actions." David was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. "I assume you'll be filing our objection to her release?" "Of course. We'll present evidence of the ongoing trauma to Emma and argue that Jennifer's release would pose a continued threat to your family's safety." "Good. But I want to do more than just file paperwork. I want to attend the hearing personally." Richard paused. "David, are you sure that's wise? Seeing Jennifer again after all these years. I want Emma to see how the justice system works, and I want Jennifer to understand that her choices have permanent consequences. Some things should never be forgiven." The parole hearing was scheduled for a cold Tuesday in February. David and Emma drove to the state correctional facility where Jennifer had spent the last 7 years of her life, passing through multiple security checkpoints before entering the hearing room. Jennifer looked older than her 39 years, with gray streaks in her auburn hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and regret. When she saw Emma, her face crumpled with emotion, but Emma's expression remained coldly neutral. "Mr. Thornfield," the parole board chairwoman addressed David, "you've submitted a victim impact statement objecting to Ms. Thornfield's release. Would you like to address the board directly?" David stood, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. 7 years ago, Jennifer Thornfield conspired with her lover to murder me and frame me for child abuse. They planned to use our 6-year-old daughter as evidence of my unfitness as a father, creating fake injuries and coaching her to lie about her safety in our home. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the room. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of poor judgment. It was a calculated conspiracy that took months to plan and would have destroyed multiple lives if it had succeeded. Jennifer chose to betray her family, endanger her child, and attempt murder for financial gain. David looked directly at Jennifer for the first time. She has served 7 years in prison, which is a legal consequence for her crimes. But the personal consequences should last for the rest of her life. Some actions are unforgivable, and some people should never be trusted with freedom again. Emma stood next to her father, her voice clear and steady despite her youth. I'm Emma Thornfield, and I was the child Jennifer planned to use as a weapon. I've grown up understanding that my mother chose money over my safety, chose her lover over her family, and chose evil over good. 7 years in prison doesn't change who she is or what she's capable of doing. The parole board denied Jennifer's release unanimously. She would serve her full 30-year sentence, with no possibility of early release. As they left the prison, Emma slipped her hand into David's. I'm proud of you, Dad, and I'm proud to be your daughter. I'm proud of you too, Princess. You understand something that many adults never learn, that loyalty and justice aren't the same thing as mercy and forgiveness. That evening, David received a call from Samuel Rodriguez with an update on Trevor Mansfield. The former doctor had been killed in a prison fight the previous week, his life ending in violence after years of threats from other inmates who despise child abusers. David felt no satisfaction at the news, only a sense of completion. The last of his enemies was gone, and the lesson was complete. Emma grew up to become a federal prosecutor like her mother had once been, but with an unshakable moral compass and a reputation for protecting children and families from predators. She never married, choosing instead to dedicate her life to justice and protecting the innocent. David remained the head of his security empire until his death at 78, surrounded by a family of loyal employees and friends who had learned that David Thornfield protection was absolute, but his revenge was eternal. The Thornfield name became synonymous with loyalty, protection, and uncompromising consequences for those who threatened families. Emma's children and grandchildren grew up understanding that some people earned forgiveness through their actions, while others earned only justice. And in federal prison, Jennifer Thornfield served every day of her 30-year sentence, dying alone and forgotten, a cautionary tale about the consequences of betraying a man who never forgave and never forgot. David Thornfield had built a legacy that would last for generations, that loyalty was sacred, that betrayal was unforgivable, and that some people deserved no mercy because they had shown none to others. The lesson was eternal, and the family was protected forever. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.